Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. So today we are going to watch a video about spinal reflexes and reaction in human. So this is my group members, which are Imran, Farisha, Alia and me, Aina Sofia. Introduction. A reflex is an involuntary and predictable response to the stimulus. These discrete neural pathways which connect through the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. These are involved in the performance of a reflex act. Such neural pathways are called reflex arcs. Most reflexes involve the brain, but some use only the spinal cord. It is a negative feedback circuit that is comprised of three main components. The first component is afferent neuron. These neurons take in information and translate it to an electrical signal that gets sent to the central nervous system. Second component is interneuron. These neurons act as sensory processing centers that determine the magnitude of the response to the incoming stimulus. They are located in the central nervous system, which is in your spinal cord. The third one is the afferent portion or motor neuron. Takes the information from the interneuron and sends it to the effectors which activate a response. The effectors are usually muscle fibers as in the patellar reflex or a gland such as the salivary gland. So let's move on to the objectives of this experiment. So for the experiment 1, we want to determine the spinal reflexes in human body. And for the second experiment, we want to identify and observe the muscle reaction time to sight as response to some sort of stimulus. And for the final experiment, which is experiment 3, is to identify and observe the muscle reaction time to touch and respond to some sort of stimulus. Experiment 6.1 Swallowing reflex. A glass of water is needed for the material. Meanwhile, for the method, the first one, we have to swallow the saliva in your mouth cavity and immediately afterwards try to swallow again. You will find it difficult to swallow for the second time. For the next step, we have to drink a glass of water and repeat procedure 1. Note that you have no difficulty swallowing in rapid succession.
Alright, now so let's move to the question for experiment 6.1. Why is it difficult to swallow our saliva in rapid succession? Is it swallowing a completely voluntary action? The answer is, the muscle on esophagus require a period for relaxation to allow the next peristalsis to occur. The second question is, explain the ability to swallow in rapid succession when drinking water compared to just swallowing saliva in your mouth cavity. It is to replace saliva in our mouth cavity to stimulate the muscle of the esophagus to swallow.
For the second experiment, which is reaction time to sight, the materials we needed are 2 stopwatches. First, both experimenter and subject should have a stopwatch each and start both stopwatches simultaneously. Next, the experimenter stops his or her stopwatch. As soon as the subject sees this, the subject then stops his or her stopwatch too. 3. Measure the time lapse between both the experimenter and subject's actions, which will give the reaction time of the subject and record in table 6.1. Lastly, repeat 10 times and calculate the average reaction time. The following table shows the results of this experiment. The average reaction time of the subject to sight is calculated by adding all time lapses and divided by 10. Thus, we will get the average reaction time is 0.14 second. The questions for experiment 6.2 is: first, is there any evidence that the subject improves with practice? The answer is yes, there is. Based on the data, we can see that the time lapse decreases from 0.44 second to 0.19 second. This shows that the subject can catch up with the experimental movements.
Okay guys, so let's move to the experiment 6.3, which is duration time to touch. The material needed is 2 stopwatch, ruler or measuring tape, and thread or rope. Right, so the procedure for the experiment 6.3 is... Oh, wait a minute. It is procedure, not material. I'm sorry. Right, so the first procedure is both experimenter and subject should have a stopwatch each and start both watch simultaneously. The subject should close his or her eyes, and the second is the experimenter press his or her watch to stop and simultaneously treat on the subject's foot. Alright, so for the third procedure is the subject then press his or her stopwatch to stop. Repeat 10 times and calculate and record the average duration time. The fifth procedure is with a thread, measure as accurately as you can the length of the nerve pathway between the point where stimulus is received, which is foot, and the part of the body which respond, finger with which the subject press the switch. Lastly, use a ruler or measuring tape to measure the length of the thread used in procedure. And here are the results of the experiment 6.3. Here are some questions for the experiment 6.3. First, is the subject's reaction time longer in the experiment 6.3 with reaction to touch compared to experiment 6.2 reaction to sight? If so, why? The answer is no. The subject's reaction time to touch in experiment 6.3 is shorter compared to reaction to sight in experiment 6.2. This is because the reaction from touch is a monoseptic route which are aware of our surrounding, while the reaction from sight is a polysynaptic route which take time to react because the signal needs to be passed from eyes, brain, spinal cord, and then to the muscle. The next question is, which of the reflex that you have investigated are spinal reflex and which are cerebral reflex? And explain your answer. Duration time to sight is cerebral reflex, which brain needs to react as the eyes are the organ that are directly connected to the brain. Our eyes sense visual information that has to be processed and decision regarding a correct course of action. Then the brain needs to send the signal to the muscle region. Reaction time to touch is a spinal reflex that doesn't need brain involvement. From the touch, the sensory neuron will send information through dorsal root ganglion into spinal cords, where the signal split into two different paths of muscle. Both signals work together, and all of this happen in spinal cord without going to the brain. The last question is, what are the reflexes are shown by human? What part of the CNS or spinal or cerebral are involved in each case? The answer is cerebral reflex is papillary light reflex, accommodation reflex, blink reflex, vestibular ocular reflex, while the spinal reflex is withdrawal reflex, cross extensor reflex, Golgi tendon reflex, and trans reflex.
In this lab session, we have conducted 3 experiments, which are swallowing reflex, reaction to sight, and reaction to touch, to investigate the spinal reflexes of humans. All of the experiments are conducted following the procedures in the lab manual to ensure accurate results are obtained. In experiment 6.1, which is conducted to investigate the reflex on swallowing, We can observe that swallowing in rapid succession without drinking is harder than swallowing in rapid succession after drinking water. This proves that saliva acts as a form of stimuli in the mouth cavity, which allows us to swallow more easily. When we swallow saliva for the first time, there is no more saliva left, as it takes time for the saliva gland to produce enough saliva for the next swallowing reflex to occur. The reason behind why we felt difficult to swallow for the second time is because we undergo peristalsis in the esophagus to move the water down to our stomach. To allow the next peristalsis to occur, the muscle of esophagus requires a period of relaxation. After we drink water, we felt easier to swallow because water acts as a stimulus that replaces saliva. Therefore, it will stimulate the esophagus to swallow.
Based on the experiment 6.2 with duration time to sight, we measured the time lapse between both experiment and subject action. For the first 5 trial, the time lapse is between 0.15 second to 0.63 second, which is increasing. For the last 5 trial, the time lapse is between 0.6 to 0.3 seconds, which is decreasing. The reason why is the time lapse different is when the subject see the experiment stopwatch, the subject receive the information and process the stimulus. Then the subject's response when see the stopwatch. Therefore, how fast can the subject react is depend on the motor. Is it called a cerebral reflex, which is use brain processing to process the information. For the experiment 6.3, which is duration time to touch, we observe and recorded the time lapse between the subject and experimenter. The results show us that the time lapse between the experimenter and the subject are not consistent. There are some factors that cause the difference in time lapse. The experimenter stopped the watch and pressed the subject's foot simultaneously, but the response of the experimenter is lower. This is because he has to wait until the information transmit to the brain. Also, it is difficult for the experimenter to carry out 2 actions simultaneously. This is because response may take time. Sensation begin as signal generated by touch receptor in the skin. They travel along the sensory nerve made up of bundle fiber that connect to neuron in the spinal cord. The signal moves to the thalamus, which relay information to the rest of brain. So, last but not least, we can conclude that spinal and cerebral reflex are distinguished. Swallowing saliva is considered as cerebral reflex, meanwhile time to touch and sight are spinal reflex. Based on the experiment, it shows us how our reflex works.